They called my name over the speaker, and she rolled her eyes. Not in secret, not quietly, right in front of everyone. I was still catching my breath from running across town to get there. I had sold my phone 2 days earlier, barely got enough to cover her registration fee. She had missed the deadline, panicked, and called me crying. Said she'd lose her spot, that she didn't want to look stupid, that no one else could help. And I believed her. Of course I did. I had $30 in my account, no savings. But I remembered the look on her face the day she got into the program, how proud she was. How I told her, we'll make it work. So I did. I walked into a used electronics shop with a phone I'd had for 4 years and walked out with cash that barely covered the fee and a receipt in her name. I never told her what I gave up. I just told her it was handled. And now, in a crowded auditorium, they said my name, probably for the payment confirmation or maybe to thank the person who finalized it, and she rolled her eyes, crossed her arms, sank deeper into her seat, like I was something to be embarrassed about. And in that moment, the silence inside me didn't just grow. It hardened because I wasn't ashamed of what I did. I was ashamed of how invisible I had become, so forgettable that my name could make her flinch. And yet, if they hadn't said it, she wouldn't be sitting there at all. I didn't say anything. I sat back down quietly, folding my hands in my lap so she wouldn't see them shake. The announcer kept reading names. The clapping resumed and life went on, at least for everyone else. But something in me stayed frozen. Like the air around me had shifted. Like the temperature dropped in a room full of people who didn't even know what had just happened. I glanced at her from the corner of my eye. She was texting, smiling now, probably with friends. As if my name hadn't just echoed through the speakers. As if the chair I was sitting in hadn't been earned by pawning. The one thing that kept me reachable, employable, connected to the outside world. I told myself it didn't matter that she was young. That maybe she didn't understand the weight of what I'd done. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about the money. It was about the moment. About the way she erased me in real time. I thought, about the way she had looked at me years ago, when a scraped knee or a forgotten lunch was enough to send her running into my arms. Back then, I was safe, important now. I was just background. The woman who figured things out. The one who always came through. And maybe she had learned, slowly, that love meant never having to look back. That I would show up regardless of how I was treated, and maybe I had taught her that. Maybe I had made it too easy to forget I was a person too. Because sometimes the worst kind of silence isn't when no one calls your name. It's when they do and someone you love wishes. They hadn't. We walked out of the building side by side, but we couldn't have felt farther apart. She was laughing with someone else, waving goodbye, already making plans for lunch. I stayed a step behind, clutching the folded program like it meant something. Like maybe if I held it tightly enough, it would give weight to everything I had. Just lost. I watched her walk ahead, carefree, proud. Free from the worry that had lived on my shoulders for weeks, and I wondered what would she have done if I hadn't paid it? Would she have missed the deadline? Would she have blamed me anyway? Or would I have finally stopped being useful long enough for her to feel my absence? I reached into my bag out. Of habit, forgetting there was no phone to check, no messages, no clock, no distractions. Just me, and this new silence I had purchased with my own erasure. She didn't thank me. Not for the payment, not for coming, not for sitting in the back of a room that she barely acknowledged I was in. And that more than the eye roll was what stuck. The absence of gratitude, the ease with which she stepped over my sacrifice, as if it were expected, as if I had been designed to give without being seen. We got into the car. She turned on. Music rolled down her window. I kept both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, and swallowed the words that were begging to come out. Not because I didn't want to say them, but because I already knew she wouldn't hear them. Not yet. Maybe. Not ever. And I wasn't sure what hurt more, her forgetting what I gave or me letting it happen in the first place. When we got home, she went straight to her room, door closing behind her like punctuation at the end of a sentence I wasn't invited to finish. I stood in the hallway for a while, staring at the space she had walked through, trying to decide if I should knock, if I should ask for what I knew I wouldn't get. But I didn't. I just walked into the kitchen, made tea with water that didn't boil, and sat alone at the table holding a mug I didn't want to drink from. I glanced at the calendar pinned to the wall. The red circle was still there, drawn months ago when I thought I might finally take a break. A weekend away, nothing extravagant, just time. That trip was the first thing I gave up. The phone came next, and now it felt like my voice was going too. I thought about texting a friend, just to say something, to feel like someone saw me. But of course there was no phone, just the silence, just me. I looked down at the mug and whispered more to the tea than to myself. Maybe I made this too easy. Because I had built my life around being the one who says yes, the one who fixes, the one who stays. And in doing so, I'd taught her that my needs came last so far behind hers that they didn't even register. She didn't roll her eyes at my name because she hated me. She rolled them because she'd never been asked to see me as more than a solution. And now I wasn't sure if she ever would, or if I even knew how to change that anymore. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, tracing the shadows from the streetlight through the blinds. I could hear her laughing through the wall in a video call maybe. Maybe with the same friends who watched her roll her eyes when my name was called. I tried to remember the last time she had asked me how I was. Not what I could do. Not what I could cover, but how I was. I couldn't recall. The realization didn't come with anger, it came with something worse. Numbness. I used to cry when she said sharp things. Now I just absorbed them, like walls do. I turned to my side and looked at the small table next to my bed where my phone used to sit. It was strange how something so small could hold so much of your world: photos, messages, reminders of who you were before you became invisible. I reached for the empty space instinctively, as if forgetting again that it was gone, that I had traded it for another chance for her to belong somewhere. And in doing so, I had erased one more part of myself. I wondered what it would take for her to see it. Would it be me not showing up next time? Would it be silence that finally taught her the sound of my presence? I didn't want to raise my voice. I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted to be real, to matter, not as a source, not as a payment plan, but as a person. And lying there, in the dark, I realized I had become a habit in her life. And habits, even the ones that hold you up, can be forgotten when they're always there. The next morning, I didn't knock on her door. I didn't make breakfast like I usually did. I didn't ask if she needed a ride or if she'd eaten. I just let the silence breathe. For the first time in a long while, I chose not to fill the space she'd grown used to me occupying. I poured 1 cup of coffee, sat alone at the table, let the quiet stretch long enough to feel uncomfortable, then necessary. I didn't do it to punish her. I did it to remember how to exist without constantly orbiting her world. She came out around noon, surprised to see me already dressed, purse on my shoulder, keys in hand. "Where are you going?" she asked. I shrugged out. She raised an eyebrow. I didn't explain. I had realized something. When you always explain, they stop wondering what you might want for yourself. I walked to the library, a place I hadn't visited in years. Not because I didn't love it, but because love had been rerouted so often toward her. There was never anything left for me. I browsed shelves slowly, sat down in the reading room, opened a book, and didn't rush to finish the chapter. I wasn't checking notifications. I wasn't waiting to be needed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt human again. Not invisible, not erased, just here. A woman in a chair holding a story that wasn't someone else's problem. I walked home lighter. She didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't offer, because some boundaries aren't announcements. They're just choices repeated until they start to feel like freedom, and I was finally beginning to make mine. The next few days were quiet. She kept to her side of the house, and I kept to mine. I didn't go out of my way to be cold. I just stopped showing up in all the invisible ways I always had. No more extra groceries for her snacks. No more just checking in texts. No more folding her laundry when she forgot it in the dryer. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel cruel. I felt honest. I was finally moving at the pace of my own needs, and it was unsettling only because it was new. I spent more time reading, walking, journaling. I even borrowed a phone from a neighbor to let a friend know I'd be offline for a while. She offered to lend me an old one. I said no. I wanted the quiet to stretch just a little longer, not forever, just until my own voice sounded louder than theirs again. On the 3rd day, she knocked on my door. That alone startled me. She hadn't done that in months. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm just taking some space." She looked confused, like the idea of me having space was a foreign language. "I didn't mean anything by the other day," she mumbled. I smiled, not coldly, just truthfully. I know, because I did. She didn't mean to hurt me. She just never had to think about how things felt on my side because I'd never made her. But I was learning now that love without boundaries is not generosity, it's slow suffocation, and I had finally stopped handing her the pen. This next chapter, I was writing it myself. No edits. No apologies. That weekend I went through the drawer where I kept old receipts, notes, and forgotten bits of myself. Buried under paper clips and faded sticky notes was the sales slip from the pawn shop, the one from when I sold my phone. I hadn't meant to keep it, but there it was. A number, a signature, a timestamp of my silence. I held it between my fingers, like evidence of a life I had built from invisible bricks, and then, without much thought, I folded it once, twice, and tucked it inside my journal, not to remember the pain, but to remember the line I promised never to cross again. Later that night, I cooked dinner for myself. Just myself. A meal I liked, the kind I usually skipped in favor of convenience, or because someone else didn't like onions. I poured a glass of wine, sat at the table, no distractions, no performance, just me. Nourishing the body I'd used like a tool for too long. She passed by the kitchen, paused, watched me. I didn't invite her to sit. I didn't ask if she was hungry, and that wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Because if I kept extending the table for someone who never asked if I'd eaten, I would stay starving forever. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. And for once, the silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like respect turned, not demanded. I wasn't punishing her. I was practicing presence with myself. Because I had spent so long fighting to be seen by others, I forgot how powerful it was to simply see myself not as an afterthought, but as someone worthy of space, even when no one else offers it. That night, I lit a candle before bed, not because it was a special occasion, but because I was learning to create softness where I used to create service. I sat with my journal and wrote one line. She doesn't owe me gratitude, but I owe myself truth. And that truth was simple. I had allowed myself to be reduced to a role helper, fixer, doer of everything, and I had called it love. But love, I was learning, doesn't mean giving until you vanish. It doesn't mean sacrificing quietly just to avoid being called difficult. It doesn't mean swallowing your worth in hopes that someone else will name it for you. I had done all of that and I was done. Not with her, but with the version of me that didn't believe she deserved to be visible. I blew out the candle, slipped into bed, felt the stillness settle over me like a soft answer. Outside, the house was quiet. No notifications, no requests, no demands, just breath, just being. And it occurred to me, this is what peace sounds like. Not applause, not validation, just the gentle click of a door finally closing behind all the versions of me that begged to be enough. I didn't need her to understand what I gave up. I didn't need her to look at me differently. What I needed, what I was finally giving myself, was permission to stay whole, even if no one clapped, even if no one noticed, because I had sold a phone to keep her world from falling apart. But I would never sell pieces of myself again just to keep the silence. That silence now belonged to me, and I had never heard anything so honest. The following morning, I took a walk before the sun was fully up. The streets were still quiet, the air cool, the world not yet rushing. I liked it that way before anyone asked anything of me. I passed a bakery just as they unlocked the doors, and bought myself something warm, flaky, unnecessary. And that in itself felt like a kind of revolution. I had spent so much of my life calculating cost, usefulness, whether something would be appreciated by someone else. But that morning, the only question I asked was, do I want this? And I did. I ate it on a bench under a tree I'd never really noticed before. It had small golden leaves that shimmered in the early light. I sat there longer than I planned, not thinking about errands or obligations, just breathing, just existing. When I returned home, she was at the table, scrolling through her phone. She looked up. Where were you? It wasn't accusatory. It was curious. I smiled, just out. There was a beat of silence. Then, for the first time in a long while, she said, "You didn't wake me." "I didn't need to," I answered. And maybe she didn't understand the weight of that response, but I did. Because waking her, checking on her, planning around her, those were habits I was finally unlearning. Not out of resentment, but out of repair. Because I couldn't keep building a home for her in my life while leaving myself outside the door. That morning wasn't about rebellion. It was about return to myself, to stillness, to the quiet joy of not being needed just to feel like I mattered. Later that day, I opened the old drawer where I used to keep my things, what little I hadn't already given away in pieces. There, beneath papers and forgotten receipts, was a photo of her from years ago. She was 5, maybe 6, laughing in the kitchen with chocolate on her face and both hands in the mixing bowl. I was in the background, blurry, mid-laugh, apron tied loosely. I stared at the image for a long time, not with sadness, but with a soft ache. I had loved her with everything, and I still did, but I had done it in a way that made me disappear. That was the part I couldn't go back to. I slipped the photo into my journal, not to forget but to remember clearly. Not just who she was, but who I had been before the exhaustion. Before love became a series of unsaid things and unpaid favors. She came into the room just as I was closing the journal. "What's that?" she asked. "Just a reminder," I said. "Of what?" I looked up and met her eyes, that I existed too. She didn't respond right away, just stood there, uncertain, like something in the air had changed, but she wasn't sure how. I didn't press, I didn't explain. I'd done enough of that in my life. Instead, I stood, poured myself a glass of water, and sat back down, this time in a chair I used to keep empty in case she needed it. Now it was Mine, and if she wanted to sit with me, she'd have to pull up her own because I was no longer offering mine as proof that I belonged. I already knew I did that evening. I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote myself a letter, not a journal entry, not a to-do list, but a real letter. I started with, "I see you," and then I let the words come. I thanked myself for showing up, for staying gentle in a world that taught me to be hard, for giving and still finding space to grow. I wrote about the time I skipped lunch to afford her ballet shoes. The winter I went without a coat so she could have a new one for school. The late nights, the forgotten meals, the dreams I'd postponed just for now that turned into years. I didn't write with bitterness, I wrote with clarity. Because those sacrifices had meaning even if no one clapped, even if she never looked back. I folded the letter and placed it in the box where my phone used to be, a symbol traded for silence. Now, a space reclaimed with truth. And when I closed the lid, I didn't feel the usual emptiness. I felt full, not with approval, not with recognition. With myself. She passed by the room later, glanced inside. "Did you get a new phone yet?" "Not yet," I replied. "Don't you need one?" I smiled softly. "I think I needed something else first." She didn't ask what, but maybe she would someday, and maybe she wouldn't. Either way, I wasn't waiting. Because this time I didn't do the right thing for applause. I did it to return to the woman who had been sitting in the background of every story. Silent, kind, whole, and now, finally ready to be heard. Even if only by herself. A few days later, I passed by the same pawn shop where I had sold my phone. The window looked different now, because they had changed the display, but because I had changed the lens. I stood outside for a moment, remembering how rushed I was, how desperate, how easy it had been to trade something personal for someone else's comfort. I didn't go inside. I didn't need anything back. What I needed was already with me. I turned away and walked on, feeling a kind of quiet pride. Not because I had sacrificed, but because I had stopped believing that sacrifice was the only way to be loved. Back at home, I took out a fresh notebook. Not to journal, but to plan. A course I'd been wanting to take. A part-time job I'd been eyeing. Small things, but they were mine. She walked in while I was making tea. "You seem different," she said. I looked up, smiled. "I think I am." She didn't know what to do with that answer. And that was okay, because this wasn't her transformation, it was mine. I no longer needed her understanding to validate my change. I had finally learned the difference between being dismissed and being done. And I was done with shrinking, with explaining, with pouring from a cup. I wasn't allowed to refill. I offered her a second mug. She took it. And we sat in the same room, two women learning to breathe differently. Not everything needs a confrontation. Some endings are quiet, some beginnings even more so. And in that silence, something bloomed. Not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, but space. Enough for both of us to sit without one disappearing for the other. The next morning, I woke up before the sun and didn't reach for anything. No screen, no alarm, no list of things to fix. I just laid there, breathing, feeling the stillness settle into my bones like something earned. For the first time, I didn't feel behind. I wasn't racing to prove anything. I moved slowly through, the kitchen humming an old song I hadn't thought of in years. It came back to me like memory does, soft, familiar mine. I opened the window and let the air in, the scent of morning, unhurried, unclaimed. She came in, hair messy from sleep, eyes softer than I remembered. "Can I help with anything?" she asked. I blinked. That was new. "No," I said gently, "but thank you for asking." She nodded, grabbed a bowl, sat at the counter. No rush, no noise, just presence. And in that moment I realized I hadn't needed an apology. What I needed was this, a crack in the pattern, a shift, the beginning of awareness, not for her to pay me back, but for her to pause, to consider, to see. And maybe she did, maybe just a little. That was enough, not to erase the past, but to let the future begin with something other than resentment. We ate in silence, but this time the silence wasn't cold. It was full, like breath held and finally released. I looked at her, not with sadness, not with hope, but with clarity. Because I had done enough, given enough. And now I was choosing what to keep for myself. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most generous thing I'd ever done. That afternoon, I returned to the small box on my shelf, the one where I'd placed the receipt from the pawn shop and the letter I'd written to myself. I didn't open it this time. I just held it in my hands like a quiet monument to everything I survived without applause. Everything I gave, not to be honored, but because I loved. I placed the box back gently. I no longer needed it as proof. I carried that truth in me now. Not heavy, not bitter, just real. Later I stepped outside. The light was soft. The sky, The kind of open blue that makes you feel like the world is waiting for you, not the other way around. I took a walk with no destination, just the sound of my own footsteps, just the permission to take up space, to exist without explanation. And somewhere between the quiet streets and the slow breeze, I whispered one final thing to myself. You never needed them to remember what you did. You only needed to stop forgetting who you are. And that stayed with me. It changed the way I moved through my home, through my silence, through my life. I had sold a phone to cover her fee. She rolled her eyes when they called my name. And still, I did not disappear. I simply shifted. I became the woman who shows up for herself now. Not out of spite, but out of something far stronger. Out of respect. Because some names don't need to be called to matter. Some stories don't need to be posted to be true. And some sacrifices don't need witnesses to leave a mark. And you? Have you ever been erased by someone you gave everything to, and finally decided to write yourself back in?